Good afternoon. Welcome to part 2 of our 3-part Forms webinar. This afternoon, we're going to go into how to build a Microsoft Forms leave request. So let me just start with some quick intros and background. If you haven't attended one of my webinars before, my name's Peter Carson. That's the non-bearded version of me. Hopefully, we're officially into spring now. I think it's time to lose the beard and get ready for summer. But I'm the president of both Extranet User Manager and Envision IT. I'm also in Office Apps and Services, Microsoft MVP. Contact information is here. We're going to share a copy of the deck as well as a recording, so you can have access to all the information that's in here. If you're not familiar with Extranet User Manager, we're a products company based in Mississauga, Ontario in Canada, just outside of Toronto, been around for more than a decade, building solutions around extranets and external sharing with users. Today's topic actually isn't about external users, it's about employees, but the same concepts apply if you wanted to do these same sort of forms types of examples. Everything I'm showing you could be done from a public anonymous facing or from an external user point of view as well. We work with clients all over, lots here in Canada and the US, as well as in Europe and different spots around the world. So quick agenda of what we're going to cover off today. We've done the introductions. We're going to start with sort of the business view of the leave request form. So this is somebody within your organization that wants to take some time off for vacation, for personal days, bereavement, sick days, whatever the scenario may be. And we've built a solution for that we use internally on Microsoft Forms. And it's a nice example on how you can leverage Microsoft Forms, which is a really simple tool for building out forms around that scenario. I thought I'd updated the agenda, but somehow I've got the expense form back in there. We're going to leave that for part 2, which happens on Thursday. And then we're going to go into a little under the hood around how we collect some employee information to support that process and how we do some analysis with Power BI. It's going to be a mix of slides and technical deep dive. So I'm going to give you sort of the slide view first to set the stage, and then we're going to get right into the actual different components and dive down under the covers. Before we do that, what I'd like you to do is take a minute and fill out a quick form survey that we have. The easiest way to do this, grab your cell phone. I've got my iPhone here. I guess I should uncover the QR code. Let me just do that. And basically open the camera app on your phone, whether it's iOS or Android. Pointed at the QR code. You don't have to take a picture of it. You'll get a little pop-up saying, hey, do you want to open this in your browser of choice? And you're into the form from there. It's pretty straightforward. Name and email address from a contact point of view. I do want to raise the background on the third question in here. Right now we're doing a Teams live event, and what that means is that I'm being recorded and streamed live. There's about a 10 or 20 second lag time from when I say something in my mic to when you actually hear it in the live event. So it makes it tough to do any sort of interactive sessions. It's not like you can unmute and do sort of live questions and things like that. I actually prefer doing Teams meetings for that reason, that they are much more interactive. If people want to share their webcam, unmute and have a live Q&A session, we can do all that in there. The downside is when you join a Teams meeting, your contact information is visible to everybody else in that meeting. You know, some people are fine with that. So, you know, if you're okay with that, just check the first option saying, hey, I'm fine having my contact info visible, potentially even my email. Depends on, you know, how Teams deals with different scenarios there. Or, you know, you'd be okay with it, but you want some directions on how to join anonymously if you don't want to share that information. Or if you'd prefer we just stay with live events, we can certainly do that from that point of view. Then we've got some questions around technology in terms of, you know, Microsoft Forms, Power Automate, Power Apps, different things that we're going to be covering off today. I want to get a sense from the audience who's familiar with what through there. If you've got some general comments you want to share on how you use Microsoft Forms, please do so. And thinking about making some of the resources available from this. So things like a white paper, similar to what we've done for our Teams provisioning, the actual Microsoft Forms template, the PowerShell scripts that I'm going to be showing you, the Flow template, the Power BI template, you know, potentially all of those. So want to get a sense of interest from people on that, whether that's useful and how they'd see leveraging that. And then if you want some follow-up from us, let us know. If you want us to leave you alone, by all means, let us know that as well. And we'll be very respectful from that point of view. So I'll leave that survey open for you to respond. We'd love to get the feedback and from there. Now, at the same time, we do have the Q&A section open in the live event. So if you've got questions or comments as we're going through, feel free to post them in there. Got a number of our staff on there, so they're monitoring and responding to those and can provide feedback from there. As we get later in the session, if we've got time, I'll circle back and have a look at what we've got in there. Logan will give me some guidance on things we want to cover there. All right, so this is the form. It's actually really simple. There's not a lot to it, and that's one of the key drivers for deciding to use a Microsoft form for this. So really, all we want to capture is what's the type of request that you're making, what's the start and end dates that applies to, the business days that this applies to. And one of the things to remember with forms is you don't have the ability to build sort of custom logic and rules and things to say, hey, let's calculate the days elapsed between the start and end date and take the weekend days out and take statutory holidays out and auto calculate a total business days. We said, let's forget that complexity. Let's just have people put in the total number of days as part of that, and then any comments from there, and they go ahead and submit it. Now, this is unlike the form that I just showed you for this webinar. This is not an anonymous form, so it does require you to log into Azure AD, and the form knows who's filling in that request, which is obviously very important from an employee self-service. You don't want somebody spoofing somebody else and filling out a leave request on their behalf and it not actually being that person. Okay. So I've just got some additional notes there from that. Things like the vacation days allocated, accrued, already taken. How do we deal with those? Yes, we could have a very dynamic form that showed all those details right on the form itself as well, but that again would take us away from Microsoft Forms and into a Power App or an HTML form, which are going to be my topics for the Thursday webinar. Now, we can't ignore security though. I mean, this is private, personal employee data, things like sick leave requests and health information is in there. We've got to make sure that security is appropriate from there. And it's really, really important that we do that properly and that we understand the manager structure, who should have access to whose data through there. Now, what about changes? Maybe somebody's done a request and it's come back and said, hey, you picked this start and end date, but you've got the wrong number of business days in there. You need to adjust that because you forgot that Monday was a statutory holiday, things like that. How do we deal with that? Well, we decided, because it's such a simple form, there's only 5 questions on it. Let's just have them cancel that request and submit a new request. Because again, being able to reopen an already filled out form and make adjustments to it is not something that we can do in Microsoft Forms. We can do that in other technologies, but again, we're trying to keep it simple and work from there. And the last thing, we want to do some reconciliation with our time tracking software. We're a consulting organization, billable hours and time tracking is very important for our staff. So we're very diligent about that. And we can actually pull that data along with the leave request data together to do some reconciliation around that. And that'll come into the Power BI side that I'll be talking at the end of the session on. Okay, so let's actually do a little deeper dive into some of the technology that we've got here. So I've mentioned Microsoft Forms. You've hopefully experienced one already now through the survey that we did at the start of the webinar. What is it? It's a very, very simple, straightforward, easy to use and build forms tool. In fact, that leave request form that I showed you with the 5 questions on it, literally 10 or 15 minutes, you can build something like that. Maybe you'll spend another 15 minutes finding a nice background and color scheme that you want for it, but it's not an onerous task and it's not a developer task. It's something that anybody can do very easily from that point of view. And building that out and doing something like the survey for the webinar that we just did, it's even got nice reporting and analytics as part of that you can use as part of that. In fact, let me see if I've got the link to the authoring side of that. Hang on just one second.
Hey, Peter, maybe now would be a good time to drop your webcam. And
oh, you're right. Yes, I'm hogging part of the screen here. Good point. I always forget about that. Let me get back to the Teams live event and switch this to full view. There we go. Sorry, I'm just going to have to get out of the presentation for a second here. Come back to the survey question. Bear with me, I'm just on my other monitor. And let's fire that link up. Okay, so if I look at the responses, we've got 14 responses in there. I just need to be respectful and kind of scroll past the contact information that we've got. So let's come in here now. And this is what comes out of the box. We didn't do anything, this is not Power BI building this out. This is literally just what Forms gives you automatically and interprets your questions and gives you some nice analytics from that. So on the question of switching from Teams live events to Teams meetings, vast majority are fine with that. A few folks would like some directions on how to join anonymously. A couple folks would prefer to stay with live events. That's a tough one to say, okay, does the majority win over? Do we stay where we are because of the couple there? We'll have to chew on that one, let you know where we go on that. In that big sort of rating section that you went through on that actually gives a nice visualization here. We can see, ranging across the, we just got another response there, bumped up to 15. So it's live too. From not sure what it is up to actively using, we can see a nice spread across all of those. And actually we've got a pretty broad, everybody's for the most part either interested in investigating or actively using all of these technologies, which is cool to see. And how are people using forms in their organization today? We've got some latest results. I could go into the details on that. And then in terms of what people were interested in, looks like we've got a lot of interest across the 15 responses in a bunch of different pieces through there. And likewise from a follow-up point of view. So cool, that allowed us to create a quick form, get it out there, publish, and then analyze the results coming out from that. So it's super easy to do from that point of view. Okay, let me come back to my deck here. Share that out again. So the next piece of the puzzle is Power Automate, formerly known as Flow. And this is the workflow engine. And typically, anytime you're doing any sort of forms work, you can have some workflow behind that. Because when somebody submits a form, something needs to happen with that. Maybe it needs to go through approval or notifications, or needs to get data entered into another system or live integrated into another system, depending on how sophisticated you want to get. And Power Automate is a great way to do that. It supports a very wide ecosystem of applications, including forms and all of Microsoft 365, but a lot of third-party stuff there as well. Now, licensing gets a little tricky. We're going to get to that in a minute in terms of standard versus premium connectors and what's included with Office 365 and things to think about from that point of view. I'm going to get more into the technical architecture in a second, but we also use what's called Azure Automation to run some PowerShell scripts. There's things in the background that we need to do, and Azure Automation is a great way to do that. Basically, you can run batch processes and scripts and things like that in the cloud serverless. You don't need to manage any virtual machines or do anything from that point of view. And it's super cost effective. I mean, you get 500 minutes of runtime free per month. So if you run a job, say once a night to look for changes in your employee structure within your organization, and it takes 10 minutes to run that, I mean, you could literally run that every day for the month and be within your free. And after that, the 10 minutes would cost you 2 cents USD to run that one run. So it's quite small sort of micro charges that we're talking about as part of that. So how do all these pieces fit together? What does the architecture look like? I'm going to get into live demo in a second here, but basically what happens is somebody fills out a Microsoft Forms leave request, and it does get stored in Forms. So just like those survey results that I was showing you a minute ago, the leave requests are in there, but they also trigger a Power Automate workflow. So every time somebody submits a form, the workflow triggers off from that. And it does a number of things. It's going to go to Microsoft Teams to do some approvals around that. So it's going to figure out who the employee's manager is. And the way that it does that is we have a batch process that basically spins through all of your users in your Azure Active Directory, so out in the cloud, and maintains a set of employee data for these processes in SharePoint. So there's a number of SharePoint lists and libraries that this process drives. And then the Power Automate can look into that in order to access that. Part of the reason that we did that is from sort of modularization and simplification. The other part was actually around licensing. If we wanted Power Automate to reach right into Azure AD and make those decisions like who is somebody's manager, it can absolutely do it. but that's actually a premium connector because you're actually going outside of 365 to do that. By putting that data into SharePoint, not only do we keep this in the Office 365 licensing that comes for free as part of your subscription, it actually makes the solution a lot simpler because, as I'll talk about, this employee data structure that we have down here, we're going to leverage it in a lot of different scenarios, including Thursday's talk on HTML forms. So we've got a common infrastructure that we can use across multiple different workflows and multiple different forms. Just makes the coding of these pieces a whole lot easier. Once it goes through that approval process, it's going to be recording information into a leave request list, and there's security around that we'll get into. It also records it into a vacation calendar, so everybody can see who's got what days off vacation. This is much more public. The leave request section is private to the individual employees and their managers. And then we can pull all that data into a Power BI dashboard and do some interesting visualizations. And we can even pull in data from our time tracking database that's in Azure SQL and mash that in as part of that as well. So let's actually go through a demo from an end user's point of view of what the whole experience looks like. So if I come back to my browser here, and let's start with my Microsoft Forms. Oh, actually, I wanted to leave that screen open. Let me just go back there for a sec. I'm going to open a brand new tab here. In fact, what I actually want to do, sorry, bear with me a minute here, is I'm going to open a new in private window, and I'm going to do the leave request there because I've got multiple different user identities that I'm using here. So I'm going to use one of my made up development staff here. So I've signed in as that staff user, so Microsoft Forms now knows who I am. In fact, it's just calling me hi staff because that's the first name of that user that's been filled in there. So we see our form that we had in the deck. What type of request am I making? I feel like I need a vacation day. What day do I want to have that on? Why don't we take Monday off? I got a big go live actually happening this weekend, so Monday sounds like a good day to take a breather from that. We're just going to leave it at the same start and end date, because the business days, it's just one day. I'm just going to take some personal time. I go ahead and submit that. Thanks for submitting. I can submit another response. Excuse me. And actually, if I come back to here, you may not have noticed it, but when I had this up previously, this had 9 responses in it. It now has 10 in here because I just submitted that net new one in through there. In fact, if I look at the detail for the responses, and I look through to the 10th one, that was staff member 2 looking for vacation on the Monday for 1 day. That's a personal time. So I've got all the data there. Took 39 seconds to complete that. Cool. So I got some stats on that. But I don't want to actually interact with it through forms. That doesn't give me a whole lot of flexibility from a workflow point of view. So what I've got is a Power Automate over here. And let's stick with it from an end user's perspective first here. So if I come to my Microsoft Teams, so I've transitioned ours. We originally built this email centric. We've actually moved it to be team centric. As an organization, we do almost no internal email anymore. Everything is Teams chats or group conversations. So it made sense to have this process go that way as well. So the first part I should show you, this is a cool little add-in for Teams called Who. If you don't have it on yours, what you can do is just click on the ... here to add apps in. You'll see it in the list. You can choose it. And then once you've chosen it, what you can do is right click on it and pin it, and it'll stay on there. What it does is it allows me to ask questions in here. Like if I say, hey, staff 2, it actually went out and found the people card for staff member 2. And it can say, okay, well, who's the manager for that person? Because that's who the approval is going to go to. It says, hey, Peter Carson, which is the person I'm signed into here now, is the manager of that person. Now, if I want to see that structure, I can actually click over here and say my org. So here's staff member 2 underneath myself. I can click into that person if I want to see more detail there and say, oh, that person, staff member 2, actually has a number of direct reports underneath that person. It's really important that you get your Active Directory manager fields properly filled in. That's what drives this whole process. So it all flows up from Azure Active Directory, which for a lot of organizations flows up from your on-premises Active Directory. How you populate that field is up to you. If you've got an ERP system or an HRIS system that manages maybe payroll or employee information, think about, if it's not already automated, how you build automation and integration to push that information from the system of record into Azure Active Directory so it properly shows up in here. Because everything you do from a workflow point of view, it's really important to understand whose manager is, so you can do approvals, you can do escalations, roll-ups, and things like that through that. So having this in here, and if you're curious, just come into that your org. You don't have to have the Who app in there. You can actually go into the chat section, and just pick somebody through here. I don't have a lot of people set up in here right now. You would see an organization tab in through there. Now, the other part of it is, I see on my activity feed, I've got an approval request that actually came through in Teams. This was actually pretty cool. It only lit up for us probably 2 months ago or so. So we built this using Flow. Flow has a fairly rich in the box approval process, which isn't just an action to do the approval. There's a whole approvals sent and received queue that you can see in Flow, and we'll show you that in a minute. But what they did is they actually lit up the approvals in Teams just recently in tenants, and you didn't have to do anything new as long as you were using those Flow approvals that used to go through email, and they are still going through email. They actually surface in Teams as well. In fact, if I go to my mailbox here, we'll see here's that vacation request as well. So I could choose to approve it in email. I could go to the Flow approval app, even on my iOS device or my Android device. I can go into Teams. The cool thing is that these are using what's called actionable cards. So right now, this email in my inbox knows that this approval hasn't actually happened yet. And likewise, the actionable card in Teams. It looks a little different, but it's got all the same information in there. That this person has requested 1 day off for these days. They have these comments on here, and this is the status of the request. So right in Teams, I can add my comment in here. Say, enjoy your day. And go ahead and approve that. So we'll see that change from requested to approved in my Teams queue here. If I come over to my Outlook, I'll give it a second. I might need to actually open the email up to get that to come through. Boom, it just changed. It says, hey, you've already completed this request. So Outlook, Teams, all the different ways you can come in, they're all aware of what's happened with that. So that actionable card, which is a super powerful way to make it easy for people to do things like approvals, just live updates within their inbox from there. In fact, if I move off that message and come back to it, there we go. We see the completion on there. All right, so let's actually go back over here and open up Teams as the person that sent the response in. So it actually comes through as a chat message. So there's a Flow chatbot that the workflow actually sent a message out saying, hey, your vacation request for March 29th has been approved by Peter Carson, and here's the comments from the approver through there. And this is the one from the standard approval as well. Oh no, this was a dry run that I was doing yesterday. Okay, yes. So I see that through there. In fact, I can come over to the approvals queue as the person that made the request, and I haven't had any requests for approval, but I can see the sent ones. So there's the one that just went through that's approved through there. I can open it up. I can see the details to say, hey, it was approved just now. It was requested 6 minutes ago. So you can see all the history through there, all the comments and all the details. So it's a very informative, very transparent process from that point of view. Okay, so that's sort of an end user point of view. We're going to dive under the hood in a sec, but before we do that, I want to talk a bit about technology choices that we've made through here. And the first is just on the whole Microsoft or Office 365 side of things. Microsoft licensing is super complex. I feel like you could write a PhD dissertation on how licensing works and still not completely understand it. I don't know if one person at Microsoft actually has the whole picture. But in any case, I mean, there's a lot of flavors of 365 to think about. So for a lot of our clients, they play in the enterprise space or even the upper mid-market. They're typically purchasing E3 or E5 plans for their knowledge workers. Maybe they're using first line licenses or frontline worker licenses that we'll talk about in a second as well. So there's a range of plans through here. And the main differences between the plans, between the E1 and the E3 or 5 is that E1 doesn't include the actual desktop Office tools, whereas E3 and E5 do. And then E5 adds a whole lot of features on top of E3 from a cloud point of view as well. But the part I want to focus on is that, with any of these plans, except for the apps for enterprise, which doesn't really include anything from a cloud point of view other than Teams. So all these other plans here include social and internet and Teams as part of that. So everything I'm showing you in terms of being able to interact with SharePoint, interact with Teams, and submit your requests through forms is covered through any of those plans. Further down, you can use these links to get to the actual live sites. You'll see Power Automate in there as well. And there's a certain number of flow runs included with each of these plans per user. So I think it's 700 runs per month per user. So it's a big number. I mean, if you have 1,000 staff, they could run 700,000 instances of a flow workflow per month. And it's combined. You could have one user that runs 699,000 of those. That's fine. It doesn't have to be evenly spread across your staff. So this is sort of the traditional Office 365. Microsoft has renamed to Microsoft 365. The difference there is that Microsoft 365 includes the OS, the Windows 10 licensing, and the EMS and security and device management licensing all bundled in together as part of that. So there's similar E3 and E5. From the perspective of what we're talking about here, they're kind of a wash from that point of view because we're leveraging all the same Teams and social and Power Automate licensing that's the same between the Office 365 E3 and the Microsoft 365 E3. You do see the F3, which is a frontline worker, coming in here. We'll come to that in a second. The other is if you're a smaller organization, there's Business Basic, Business Standard, which are obviously at a lower price point. There's limits on how many users you can have underneath those plans. But the important thing is, again, you still have Teams, you still have OneDrive, SharePoint as part of that, so you can leverage all that from that point of view. And then the last one is what they call frontline workers. The idea here is that they're not knowledge workers. They're people that are typically out in the field. Maybe they're retail staff, maybe they're shop floor staff. They don't need to be on a computer all day, but they still need to communicate with the organization. They still need to be able to do things like take a day off and book that request. And the interesting thing is that even at the F1 level, which I wasn't even aware that they've done this change, but they brought a lower price tier. I mean, it used to be $5-6 a month was the lowest price you could get 365 for anybody in your organization. Now you can do it for $290. It doesn't include a mailbox. So if you don't need that person to have email, that's fine because they still have Teams. They can still have chats. They can still belong to channel conversations as part of that. They still have access to your intranet for employee information. And we can do all the employee self-service, like the leave requests that we're talking about in this plan here. There's some details I still need to dig into because Power Automate licensing is not part of the F1. But if the users are simply submitting a Microsoft form and all the approvals and everything else happens with somebody who is licensed for a higher tier, is that acceptable or not? I think I need to reach out to Microsoft Legal on that one to see what the details are there. Then the other thing is Power Automate's not the only story. I mentioned this, I think, in my previous webinar. There's also Logic Apps, which is the underlying technology that drives Power Automate. Now, it doesn't have the same rich approvals process that Power Automate has, so there's some advantages to that. And Power Automate, like I mentioned, there's 365 plans cover all the standard 365 connectors. So if you can stay in that world, likely you're not going to pay anything additional for Power Automate. But if you start using premium licenses, like trying to access Azure AD directly or connecting to your HRIS system or your payroll system or something like that, those would typically be premium licenses. And it's either $15 per user per month, or if you've got enough users in your organization to spread that across, it probably makes more sense to license them by the flow. So if you've got 1,000 people in your organization that need to use 5 flows because there's a 5-flow minimum, rather than spending $15,000 a month for those users, you could say, let's just spend $500 a month. We can have as many users as we want in through there. You got to balance, how many workflows do you have? How many staff do you have? Where's the break-even point from that point of view? Whereas logic apps are very much consumption based, which is how everything typically happens in Azure. So there it's very much cost per action. So those are steps in your workflow. These are millionths of a cent, so they're very small numbers. They add up, but they take a long time to get into the thousands of dollars a month. They're also nicer from a software development lifecycle point of view. You know, the ability to build out template deployments and continuous integration and DevOps, all the cool stuff from a sort of an enterprise development point of view is much easier to do with logic apps than it is to do with Power Automate. So it depends what makes sense from that point of view. Okay, so let's get under the hood. Let's dive into the technical side. We're about halfway through the session. I want to make sure we got lots of time to get into this. So we're going to talk about security. We're going to go through the information architecture that we've set up in SharePoint. We'll look at the Microsoft form, how it's built. It's super easy. I'm going to show you the actual PowerShell and Azure automation that we're using to do that Active Directory querying and building up the employee data, the actual workflow in Power Automate, the integration into Teams, and the Power BI dashboard. So we got a fair bit to go in. Let's dive right in. So first, around security considerations, and I can't overemphasize this first point enough of don't do security through obscurity. I don't know how many times I've gone into organizations, and you know, often it's not the IT team, maybe it's somebody in the business that's done something with forms or with Power Apps, and they've built a really cool little app. You know, maybe it's collecting COVID information from a screening point of view, and it's capturing personal health information on a Microsoft form and putting it into a SharePoint list, and they're just kind of hiding where that list is, hoping that people don't discover it. That's not a good way to deal with security. You got to make sure that you do it right, and that information is secure. And really, that comes down to properly leveraging Azure Active Directory. It's the security foundation in everything Microsoft. So all your permissions, your manager reporting structure that drives who gets to see what, you know, that should all be correct and complete in your Azure Active Directory. You know, from a staff point of view, they obviously need to see their own requests. So how do we manage that? I'll show you in a minute when we get into the SharePoint side, but we don't want to set permissions on every single item. It starts to have scalability issues. So what we did is said, okay, let's create folders for each staff member, even in lists. You can create folders in lists. It's not a common thing, but it works quite well. And then we can assign permissions to the folders, and it doesn't matter how many leave requests go into that folder. You know, typically we're not going to see thousands from one person. It's going to scale well from a scalability point of view. And then obviously managers need to see their direct and indirect. So leverage that manager reporting structure in Azure AD to apply their permissions. So that's part of the job of the PowerShell that I'm going to show you. It's not only just getting that employee data, but it's setting up the right permissions so the right people have access to that. Dealing with changes, cancellations, you know, we took a simple approach, as I mentioned, with this one. Just submit a new request through there. And also think about, you know, what's your BOT plan? Should staff be able to access from outside the firewall through mobile devices? It's all there and possible. I mean, you may choose to lock it down if from a policy point of view, you're not comfortable with that. Personally, I'm a fan of making sure that you have the right conditional access policies, multi-factor authentication, things like that, that you can be happy that on non-corporate devices, things like this are still secure and available to staff. So let's have a look what we did, you know, those staff 1 through 15 that I was showing you that we're going to get into on the dev site. You know, there's a rough correlation to our company structure. We sort of use that as a model to say, okay, we've got 18 staff currently in our company. Let's just pick sort of a 3-level structure. So we've got myself at the top, we've got a couple folks in the middle, and then folks underneath there from a reporting structure point of view. And how do we map that out from a SharePoint point of view? I'll show you in the SharePoint site in a second, but basically we've got a number of lists and libraries that drive this system. So the first one is the employee data. All the information about an employee, what's their name, their email address, their UPN, their user principal name, which is kind of their security identifier to Microsoft, who's their manager, do they have an employee number, all of those sorts of details are kept in employee folders and employee data. And then as people are making requests, we're going to talk more about the expenses in the next webinar, but on the leave request side, even though this is a SharePoint list, we can still create folders for each employee, and we can set permissions on each of those folders appropriately from there. And then the vacation calendar is sort of the public to the organization. Everybody can see who's got time booked off, so they can plan accordingly from a resourcing and scheduling point of view. Okay, so let's dive over onto SharePoint. So if I come in here, up a new tab. So what we've done is created a site collection called Employee Self-Service. You can call it whatever you want, but I find it does make sense to dedicate a site collection to this and have all the structure in there. So if I look at my site contents here, we'll see those same lists and libraries that were on our diagram over here. So we've got the employee data, which is a document library. One thing that I didn't put on the diagram is an employee documents. This is something that we've been using for our review processes to say, hey, when we do annual and mid-year reviews, there's typically a Word document that goes with that. There's maybe a working documents area for staff to put stuff as preparation for the review. Let's have a spot for that. So it's not so much a forms process, but it can actually leverage off of this same process. All the same security applies as to who gets to see what in there. We've got the leave requests lists that have the requests in them, and we have the vacation calendar list. So let's start at the employee data level. So we've got the staff 1 through 15 plus my folder in here with all the data in there. So if we take that staff member 2, who's the person that we were using for demo purposes. So I dive into that folder. There's what's called a JSON file. This is a data file that's used by the Power Automate. It can be used by forms. There's a variety of different ways it can be consumed. And basically it has all the information about that employee. What's their employee number, their first name, display name, user principal name, what's their hierarchy. So this particular person reports up to myself. What department do they belong to, their direct manager, their job title, their email address. So all the details are in here. And I'll show you when we get to the Power Automate how we can consume this and easily leverage it without having to do a lot of work to go talk to Azure Active Directory. So it keeps it simple from that point of view. Now, the other thing I want to show you, if I come over here on the Manage Access, we can see that I have owner access because I'm sort of admin on this whole process, and staff member 2 has read-only access to this particular folder. And that's important. We don't want people messing with their employee data, but they should be able to see it. The data is there to support the back-end processes, not for people to go in and edit and change their manager so somebody different approves from there. So that's part of the security is understanding, have we applied the right permissions and only enough for what people need to do from that perspective. Okay, so let's go back to our site contents. The employee documents, it's very much the same structure, all the same folders, all the same rules apply as to who has access in there. So if I come down into that staff 2 folder, with the exception, so if we look at the manage access here, it looks the same as to what we were just seeing. But if I go down into this working folder, and now I look at the manage access, staff member 2 now has read or edit access to this folder. So this is a spot they can drop their working documents, work together with their manager on, and then once the review is completed and it becomes a record, it can be put into the upper level folder, and it's then read only from that point forward. So it's nice flexible structure from that point of view. So next we've got the actual leave request list. So this is where the workflow writes the request to, and we can see here is our vacation member or staff member 2 request that just went in for that Monday coming, and all the details around that request are in there. So if I do an edit on this particular item, we see we've got site columns or list columns that have been defined for each of the fields that somebody filled out in the form, like what's the request type and the start and end date and total business days. But we've also got fields for who the employee was, which they didn't pick. It was by nature of who logged in and filled in the form, and who their manager is, which comes from that employee data. Who is it assigned to from an approver? What's its status? So all those workflow type fields are captured in the list here as well. Now you might say, well, this is going to get filled up and we're going to run into issues with more than 5,000 items at one level in SharePoint. That's a problem from a scalability point of view. What we're not seeing in here in this view is that there's actually a folder structure underneath here. So if I switch this to, where did my folder view go? That's weird. It was here yesterday. No. Let me just edit this view for a sec. I'll get to show you how you play around with views. So I can decide what columns I want to show in this view, but the important thing I want to do down here is in this folder sections here, I want to show items inside folders. I should probably save this as a different one, but for time's sake, I'm just going to go ahead and overwrite that one. So now we see that same view that we were seeing before. And if I come down to staff member 2, and I look at its access, all of its permissions are properly set in here. If I open up that item, now we see that the requests that have been submitted by that staff member. And it's not just staff member 2 that can see this, it's their manager and everybody up the reporting structure has visibility to that. And what you can do then is you can start to create interesting views here to say, hey, I want to look at historical submissions. I don't have any myself. From a manager perspective, I didn't queue this part up and dry run it. But the idea is you can create views that become very easy for people to see their own status from there. In fact, let me come back here, see if I can get it on the staff member 2 view. There we go. So now I'm seeing my upcoming vacations. I had a dry run that I booked for the 25th and this one that I just did right now for the 29th. So you can create different views so people can see the requests through here. And this is where you can build out sort of historical, pending approval, stuff at the manager level, with the staff level. You can do all that just through creating custom views in SharePoint. You can embed these as web parts on pages and provide that as some of the feedback to your staff through there. So it becomes very flexible from that point of view, and it's a no-code solution. You don't have to code all these different things up. It's all visible through SharePoint. So if we come back here, the last one I want to touch on is the vacation calendar. So once a request is approved, like there's my March 29th one, it shows up in the calendar view here. In fact, we can put it back into the old classic calendar view. They haven't created a modern view of this. They've talked about it, but I haven't seen it light up just yet in 365. So this is a nice spot to be able to come and see, all of your staff. You could have filtered views of this to filter it by department or by manager if you wanted to see different levels within your organization and understand who's going to be off when from that perspective. So lots you can do just leveraging the out-of-the-box SharePoint side of things. So let's switch gears now. Let's go to the actual Power Automate side. Or actually, sorry, I wanted to go to the forms first. So here's my leave request form itself. I've got my 5 questions on here. It's very simple. If I want to add a new question onto this, I won't actually save that back, but I can define what type of questions and options that I want through that. Does it have multiple answers? Is it a required field? There's a lot of options, even branching, that you can add in from that perspective and build out quite a rich form as part of that. So it's super easy to build this out. I haven't put any branding on this particular one, but you can put company logos and colors and such on there and build a very nice form from that perspective. So now if we come over to Flow, there we go. Oh, I zoomed this way out so I could get a snapshot. Let me go back to 100% view. Okay, let me start out at this level here. So this is the Envision IT leave request flow. We can see it last ran 25 minutes ago when I did the demo through there, and that flow succeeded. So let's actually start by looking at the run itself. I find this really useful when I'm debugging or reviewing a flow, because you can see these green check marks shows each step that it's gone through as part of that. So the flow starts out with somebody submitting a form response, and literally seconds after they submit that form response, it triggers off in here, and I can do another step in here to say, go get me what was filled out in that form. So I can actually see all the fields that were on that form, the comments, start and end date, request type, all that detail is there. It's also there in JSON format if I want to get sort of harder core from that point of view, but I can use these fields as they are right through there. So this is where we use that employee data. So it says, go get that employee JSON data that I was showing you before for the staff to person. So it uses that particular path to go find that JSON file. And here's that same data that we were seeing in that text file of all the details and hierarchy and manager of this particular employee. And then we can use a parse JSON step in Flow to actually parse that out and get the explicit data value, so we can use them in later steps through there. So if we want to get the employee number or the first name of the person, we can then use that in steps below from there. Now, I'm going to skip ahead and then come back a bit What we're doing here is we're posting to the leave request list all the data that got filled out on the form. So we're posting in the title and the employee ID, the manager ID, request type, all those details are going in through there. Now the secret sauce here is this employee ID and this manager ID. If I come back to my actual leave request list, so this is the list that it's getting posted to. So let's go to my list settings for a second here. You'll see that the employee is a person or group field and the manager is a person or group field. What that means is when we post that back to SharePoint, we can't post the name or the UPN or the email address of the person. We have to post an ID, which is an internal number in SharePoint that represents that person. And it's different in every site collection. It's just, way back 15, 20 years of history of SharePoint, that's the way it was built from that point of view. So we have to go find those employee IDs. So what we have to do is actually do a request to SharePoint to say, do a post to this API endpoint by email address to get that user's ID value back. So that's what this is doing. And then we have to do the same thing for the manager as well. Then we can parse that out and get the actual ID number as part of there. There's our ID of 50 that we're using here. So it takes a little work to get this part here, but once you've got it figured out, it works really well from that point of view. Now, I've often been asked, hey, you're doing, HTTP calls as part of your Power Automate. Doesn't that become a premium connector? Well, this is kind of a special HTTP request call because it's part of the SharePoint connector, and it's specifically provided for licensing purposes. It means that we can do HTTP calls to API endpoints in SharePoint that the Microsoft team hasn't built actions for in Power Automate, and that it still counts as a standard connector. We're not getting pushed into a premium connector, because if they haven't provided the ability to do it through regular out-of-the-box connectors and we have to do it this way, don't penalize us for that and make it a premium type of workflow. So this all still stays as a standard licensing model through here. So we get all that data, we post it into the list, and then we start the approval. And this action just names who the approver is going to go to, and that came from the manager information. All the details are in there, and then we've got a conditional step here. It says yes or no, did it get approved? If it didn't, post a message saying, hey, it got rejected, but you can see there's no check marks there. It did go down the approval process here. So it updates the item in SharePoint to say, hey, we want to mark this as manager approved with the comments. And we also want to go into the way down in here, wow, the vacation calendar, and create an item in there as well. So that's available and visible for anybody to see from that point of view. And then the last step, post a bot message out, and that's what we saw in the Teams showing up saying, hey, your vacation has been approved. So that was the actual live run through that we saw through there. I can go into edit mode here, and I can actually see the underlying logic through there. So when we set up the trigger, we have to tell it which Microsoft form. We got a whole bunch of forms in this particular tenant, but it is the leave request form that we want it triggered off. And we want to use the response ID for this particular response against that form ID to get the details. And then we can start using the results from those previous steps. So here we want to get the employee data file. We need the details of the responder's email as part of that to look up the right JSON file. So these things here, when I click on those, they're actually called dynamic content. So I can see down here, here's all the response details, all the things that got filled out in that form. And I can choose any of these as parameters for later actions through here. Likewise, when we're getting the employee data, we're going to get that file and parse that JSON. Here where we're going to look up the employee ID, we're doing it by user principal name. This is a part that I'm still working on right now. A number of these staff users don't have mailboxes. They are F3 users. And I haven't quite got this part working because they don't have an email address. And I got to figure out how to look them up by UPN and get that to work from that point of view. Because I don't need to actually send any emails. We're doing it all through Teams. But this part of the ID integration is still very email centric. Pretty sure I can work around that when I get past that. And then when I'm posting, I'm building up a big HTML post that's got all those different parameters that came across. So basically I'm building a big block of JSON, which is what the SharePoint API looks for. of what needs to get posted back and written to SharePoint. I can parse that back and start the approval, because what I want is to actually put a link to the request that was created so that somebody can click on that and actually see the details from that, but also include right in the actionable card things like who it was and days and date. Ideally, they shouldn't need to look at the SharePoint list item. They should have everything they need to make a decision right in the approval actionable card here. We come through the condition where it says, hey, look at the result of the approval step. Was it equal to approve? Yes, come down this path, update that item. So we want to write that particular list item for the leave request. We have to provide the title again, even though we don't want to change it. If you don't provide it, it bombs out from that point of view. The important thing we want to do is fill in the status to be manager approved and put the manager approver comments in there. And then similarly, create a new item on the vacation calendar. We've got all those points through there. And then post out through the chatbot to the person that made the request. Here's all the details of what's happened through here. So you've got a lot of flexibility to build out not just dynamic content, but you can build expressions using functions and get quite sophisticated in terms of what you put into these bodies through here. And we've got similar things here, updating the status to be denied and posting out the appropriate response from that point of view. So that's our flow workflow. I know I'm starting to run tight on time here, so let's keep rolling here. Let's actually switch over to the PowerShell side of things. So if you're not familiar with PowerShell, don't worry, you don't necessarily need to understand the deep details of this, but basically what this is doing, let me come down through here. So it's connecting up to SharePoint, it's connecting up to Azure AD, and it's doing a query against Azure AD and saying, go get me all the users that match a particular query. They have an employee ID, I want to get these fields from them, and then spin through each of those users. And basically what it's doing, actually let me run it in the background here. So I've got it set up to either go to development or prod. I'm going to leave it at development. It basically looks at each of those users and it looks for differences. I mean, we only have 15 staff here. We've got clients using this architecture with thousands of staff. It can take a very long time to run this the first time, upwards of, even beyond a day sometimes to do a first run through. But once you've populated it, you see it runs quite fast because what it's doing is it's comparing and looking for differences. So if the person's hierarchy and all their employee data is exactly the same as it was yesterday, you don't do anything more from that point of view. If it is different, then go fix up all the security or create a new record if they're a brand new person, do all that work through there. So that's basically what this is doing, is figuring out all that user data and then doing a comparison to see if that's changed. If it has, go update it and then set up all the security against that for the different libraries. And then continue through the next one from there. And the way we run this is we set it up in what's called a Azure Automation account. So you can configure a schedule and it just runs in the cloud. You don't need any sort of server running this from that point of view. So it's nice from that perspective. Okay, so last piece is on the Power BI side. So we've got a Power BI dashboard, and I've got some anonymized data of some actual data, which is a little easier to see and understand from that point of view. So let me pull that up here. So if you're not familiar with Power BI, there's a Power BI desktop tool. It's the preferred tool to actually build your queries and get your data model together and build your visualizations. And then you publish that to Power BI and it becomes available in the service for anybody to consume. Licensing thing to be aware of, there is a Power BI free license, which is a big misnomer in 365. All that lets you do is publish your own report to your own Power BI service and see it yourself. You can't share it with anybody else. If you want to publish this dashboard out so other people can see it, each of those people need a Power BI Pro license, or you need Power BI Enterprise for your organization. So I don't have licensing slides on that side, but I just want to make sure you understand the implications of using Power BI. It's an awesome tool, though. We use it to run a lot of our business. And being able to get these sorts of visualizations where I can say, hey, let's have a pie chart of what type of requests people are doing. But it's interactive. I can click on the vacation part of the pie and all the other graphs as appropriate will update from that. So if I want to understand what's happening from that perspective, or maybe I want to dig into staff member 2 in more detail, and now I see their request types just for that staff member, because you see everything else is grayed out. It's highlighting against that particular employee. And here we actually bring in allocations as well. So we know how many vacation days somebody starts the year with, how many they've taken, how many carryovers from previous year, personal days, things like that. We can mash all of that data up into here and make it part of the dashboard. So, I mean, this was actual company data as of mid-summer, I think, last year. So we're right in the middle of COVID. Actually, it was maybe late summer. And it was concerned that, people had taken less than half their vacation and we were well past halfway through the year. Wasn't surprising. Nobody's going on holidays during COVID, but it is something to be aware of from a management point of view. We want to understand what's our liability from that point of view. Do we need to make adjustments to our carryover policies as to how much vacation people can carry across? So having this kind of data at this level, rather than a massive Excel with a ton of numbers on it, it's way more actionable. You can look at this, understand it, make decisions, and work from that point of view. Okay, let me come back to my deck. So some quick wrap-up points. Logan, if you want to interject, if there's questions I want to look at there as well, by all means do that.
Yeah, I was going to say, Peter, there are some good questions there. I've published them out. Maybe we should spend a little bit of time on those.
Sure.
First one, so our users have access to Teams, but are actually Gmail users. Can they still use the approval app?
So they have access to Teams as guest users, or they're licensed for Teams. I think that's probably the key there. Microsoft's pretty picky about external users need to actually be external to your organization. If you try and cheat and say, I'm going to make my staff external users, the system won't stop you from doing that. They can enforce that, but if you ever get audited from a licensing point of view, you're going to face a charge from that point of view. But if they don't only have access to Teams and they don't use Outlook Mail, yeah, that is my goal, is that they should be able to use all this from that point of view, assuming that they are properly licensed for Teams and SharePoint.
Okay. Another one, Peter, what are some best practices around licensing when creating apps where you have users with a per app license, but flows that use premium connectors?
So the beauty of I think what you mean by per app licenses is that $100 per flow license. So that allows you to use premium connectors in that flow and to have as many people access that as you desire. And you can actually mix and match. You could say, you know what, we've got 10 flows in our organization for different purposes, and 5 of those use premium connectors. You could pay the 5 times 100, $500 to have unlimited users use those, and you could use your 365 licensing for your other 5 that are doing standard. So it's not an all or nothing. You may have a mix of some that use premium and some that don't. You only need to buy connectors for the ones that use premium. If you decide to use per user licensing, it doesn't matter how many flows you have one way or the other, because it's a user basis at that point.
Okay. Have you automated the folder creation process for new employees?
Yeah, so that PowerShell script that I was showing you there, I'd already run it on this particular tenant, but when I first ran it, none of those folders were there, and it will create all those folders. It'll put all the employee data in there. It'll create the folders and all the other lists and libraries as part of that. The only thing it won't do is remove folders, because really, even if a person's left the organization, you probably want the history of requests that they've filled out and employee documents they've got in there from that point of view. So it will always add net new. And even if manager structure changes, it will clear the permissions and reset the permissions to the new manager structure from there.
Okay. And then the last one here is, isn't there a built-in get manager function that's part of Power Automate or Flow?
I think there is, but in our case, we wanted to do more with it than just in Flow. As we'll talk about in Thursday's session, we actually use that employee data for the HTML forms as well, and other purposes of that. So yes, we could have used the out of the box for that, but this infrastructure is kind of there for more than just finding out the manager. And does the flow apply folder permissions? No. So yeah, you're right, Logan. The PowerShell applies the permissions from that point of view. So quick wrap up points here. I know we're almost at the top of the hour. This is one scenario. Tool choices don't have to be one size fits all. Use it where it makes sense. Understand the licensing implications, the mobile, bring your own device. Can't emphasize enough. Make sure you do security properly. Make sure your Azure AD is clean and fully populated, which is going to help you do security properly. And start simple. Microsoft Forms is a great way to get your foot wet into the whole employee self-service forms side of things. I'm sure you're probably aware we're doing part 3 on Thursday, which is getting into a more complex HTML expense form. So we've got the registration up for that. Also, some related topics, the software development and secure development. I mean, they're going to go deeper into topics I talked about here, like how do I manage security in my runbooks in Azure Automation, in my forms, in my APIs, as such, as part of that. And then last, we've got a couple other topics coming up. One around compliance and document collection with external users. And then an interesting one also on the Power BI side of being able to build a data model that harvests data from multiple planners. You can do things like portfolio management across plans and Planner and Power BI. So check those out if you're interested. We are literally at the top of the hour, so I think that's it for me. I want to say thank you for everybody for joining in. Have a great rest of your day. Bye now.